Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. This story is called Satan's Town and it's by Bob Johnston. The newspaper headline summed up the situation rather well. Last minister leaves Satan's Town. George Smith finished his pint, rolled up his paper and left the bar. A few locals looked up as he walked past, but no one said anything. No one ever spoke to him these days unless they absolutely had to. Even in the shops, transactions involved the minimum of communication. He stepped out into a thick sea fog and turned left for the hill leading to the bank. He walked cautiously. He doubted anyone from the pub would follow him. It was too warm and cosy there, but it was still early enough for children and teenagers to be about, and they had become noticeably more violent in the recent months. He stepped into the light from the ATM machine and quickly drew some money for the following day's shopping, before crossing from the bank to the lane opposite. Down a shallow slope stood the old lowland church where lights were burning through stained glass. He moved forward, placing his feet carefully on the uneven path, and made his way to a lit window. A regular chanting came from within, but the window was a little too high for Smith to see in. A drainpipe ran down the side of the window, though, and Smith gripped it as tightly as he could and found a foothold on the wall. Feeling every day of his years, he hauled himself up and finally stood, hugging the drainpipe and looking in on the old church. A group, dressed in black robes, sat in the pews listening to a similarly dressed figure who threw his hood back right by the altar just as Smith lost his footing on the slimy wall and fell to the ground. He landed on his feet, but his old knees gave way, and he ended up in an untidy heap on his side. He heard running feet and just had time to look up before he was hauled to his feet and held in a painful full Nelson. The entire group appeared and stood about in silence. The man from the altar walked straight up to Smith and slapped him, noisily but not painfully, across the face. "How dare you, Smith?" he said. Smith grimaced as his arms were pulled a little harder. "I was curious as to how long it would take you after Reverend Palmer left." The man signalled for Smith to be released. "We bought the church fair and square, Smith. We can do what we like with it." Smith stood, rubbing his aching arms. "I'm not saying you can't, Sinclair. Like I said, I was just curious." Sinclair simply glared at him. He was furious, struggling to restrain himself. Finally he spoke. "Okay, Smith, if you're so curious. Come in. Watch." Smith shook his head and opened his mouth to speak, but Sinclair stepped forward. "Oh, I insist, Smith." Sinclair turned and walked back to the main entrance. The rest followed him, dragging Smith with them. Inside, the ceremony began immediately as Smith sat impassively. He had seen it all before: the chanting, the unpleasant demand, the curses on the enemies, the mumbo-jumbo. This ceremony was like every other pseudo-Satanist claptrap he had seen or read about. Claptrap finished, Sinclair stepped down from the altar platform and stood in front of Smith. "Happy?" he asked. Smith simply looked at him with utter distaste. "Ecstatic, Sinclair." Sinclair smiled coldly. He looked at one of the guards. "Throw him out onto the street. No need to be gentle. And Smith, we didn't bother the Christians when they were in town. Leave us alone." Smith reached home half an hour later, lightly bruised, and noticed that the house had been attacked again. The kids had long ago given up trying to smash his windows, which were now strengthened glass covered with wire. Their trick now was balloons filled with paint. All the front downstairs windows were covered in yellow paint, and someone had crapped on his doormat. He sighed. At the moment, he was in too much pain to be troubled by cosmetic damage. Pausing only to remove his shoes, he climbed the stairs and fell on top of the duvet, and in a moment, he was fast asleep. Smith woke the following morning and gave up any thought of shopping. It was just too much stress. He ate breakfast and settled down to do some reading. This involved a careful study of all national newspaper reports on the events in Stanton. The earliest he'd been able to find was from 5 years before, when a witches' coven had purchased a disused Highland church. The outcry at the time had been enormous, and a ridiculous accusation of ritual satanic abuse by the witches against their own children had been made. It was finally thrown out of the court, but not before a dozen children had been taken into care, and the old church, torched by town elements, remained at large. Smith had lived in Stanton for more than 30 years. Over this period, he had made a special study of the rise of Satanism, coming to the comforting conclusion most of it was just sensationalised nonsense. Some of it was not, though, and the events of the last 5 years showed a developing trend. For whatever reason, Stanton and a dozen after towns had come to the attention of dedicated Satanists, all protected by freedom of religious statutes. The churches had attempted to fight back, but their ageing off interested. Congregations simply could not set coffee mornings against colourful ceremony and the probable BS, a promise of sexual orgies that just did not exist. Smith had long studied the growth of these groups and had come to the conclusion that it was mostly harmless, if annoying, tripe. He opened a 4-year-old newspaper at the announcements page and went to see what notices he could find. The churches had gone mad at the advert, but again the Satanists were protected by law. Along with the usual church announcements was one from the Church of the Beloved Satan, the baptism of 4 infants conceived during some ceremony of the expulsion, a ceremony never mentioned anywhere else previously. Smith got up and opened the curtains. He had forgotten the paint tack and groaned at the sight of yellow splashes all over his windows. He lifted the phone and called in the vandalism to the police. Nothing would be done, but they would show up, take notes. Smith was a great believer in getting his money worth from the police. They were all Satanists too, but they still went through the notions of being police and doing their jobs properly. Though all of this, Smith had attempted to keep some unity among the non-Satanists in the town, but in the end, the day-to-day pressure was too much. Most people had moved away. Of 6,000 inhabitants, he reckoned only a few hundred in the town were not active members of the church, and to sweeten the deal, the Satanists always paid a fair price for the homes they were occupying. The day moved along, and it was early evening before Smith found a reference which really disturbed him. He lifted the phone and dialed Sally. A few minutes later, he painfully pulled on his coat and stepped out of the door, ignoring the foul abuse of a group of 10-year-olds at the bus stop. Sally opened the door only after ensuring it was definitely him. She swiftly shut it once he was in. She smiled, but he could see that she was exhausted. As an old lady, she tended to be on the receiving end of the threats and intimidation more than he was, but it was only a matter of time. Smith spread out the newspaper and pointed to the column that he saw. Sally put on her glasses and leaned forward to read. Spokesman for the Church of the Beloved Satan, Gordon Sinclair, said today that he was delighted that all the congregations in Stanton have united as one church. The arrival of a new high priest, Al Jackson from the United States, will be the final step in consolidating Stanton as a base for future expansion. Sinclair, speaking for Jackson, said that the church opens in arms to all and extends the blessings of Versoden and Bawisust to any who have an interest in its activities. This report feels compelled to say that events in Stanton, or as now Satan's Town it's called, must be viewed as a cause for concern. I had hoped that the death of organised religion would lead to a bright, secular future, rather than a degeneration back to witchcraft and superstition. God help us all. And that is the first part of our story, guys. Very interesting, because I actually did, well, I've been saying it for a while that we're going full circle and we're going to see witchcraft coming back, and then we're going to get all this superstitious stuff coming back, and I do believe we're going to go into new sort of witch trials and stuff. I do believe it's going to go full circle. I do. And I kind of like this story because it's kind of what it's doing. It's going full circle, but it's using Satan as a religion rather than Catholic, I suppose. Anyway, join me next time as we continue Satan's Town. Many blessings.